Hello, this is my design presentation for Canyon. So, obviously, this play was published at the end of 2018, but is about the months leading up to the 2016 election. And my concept and what drove all of my dramaturgical research was inspired by the stage direction at the very beginning that says, "Before everything changed." That stage direction almost feels sarcastic to me because obviously the election of Trump was a huge deal that is not to be understated. He has absolutely decimated whatever remaining threads of a reputation that the US has had on a global scale. But I felt that so many white people after the election were like, this is so unprecedented. I'm so shocked. But like people of color and marginalized communities were kind of like, yeah, of course, this is sort of how this country's always been, It kind of just revealed exactly what they've always experienced that maybe other folks just haven't, being in their bubble. So I went into a lot of detail about the idea of the liberal bubble, and found a lot of really interesting information about it in the 2016 election. So my concept, of course, was derived by the hateful hypocrisy of the characters and by the phenomenon of the media liberal bubble that left so many people in shock after the 2016 election. Political experts in the United States tend to not be a very diverse group, and they place a lot of faith in one another, so it does not take long for the politically leaning left media establishment, which is essentially all of the media establishment now, to get into a consensus with one another. This is exactly what the New York Times did, according to Nate Silver of 538. They called a Clinton victory 3 weeks before the election and held on to this prediction, calling a Trump victory virtually unthinkable. Of course, we all know if that we had a more functional or honest electoral system, she would have, though the concept of the bubble still remains. Many folks in big cities assumed Clinton was an obvious winner. Myself, living in rural Montana at the time, knew otherwise, of course. So, more interesting things that I researched during this time, I dove into Rikers Island. Obviously, this is very much in the news right now because it's the main jail for New York City. It's on the East River between two of the boroughs, and it's known for being one of the worst kept correctional facilities in the U.S. Abuse and neglect of inmates is extremely commonplace, very evident now, showing the state's handling of inmates' lives and well-being during this COVID crisis. Thankfully, during October 2019, the New York City Council voted to close the facility by 2026, which is of course not soon enough, but thankful it's still happening. And this movement to close Rikers Island heated up in February of 2016, meaning that it would have been happening, and this prison abolition movement would have been happening just a few months prior to where the characters in the play are now. So that sort of complicates Delia's whole relationship with her husband's job for me, because obviously she has a lot of problematic views that she needs to work out on her own. But perhaps another underlying reason why she's so resentful of what her husband does as a career is because maybe she was afraid this prison abolition movement would eventually lead him into being out of a job, and maybe his work she sees as being, a part of this prison abolition movement. So that sort of complicated things for me in a very interesting way. But essentially, my concept for this whole show is the idea of a bubble, of this protective place that liberal people can hide themselves in and think that the world is a standy place because everyone around them has the same views as them, while they're unknowingly isolating, the folks that they pretend to be protecting, or claim to be helping, I suppose. So, on to some of my lighting concepts that highlight this. I would like there to be a moment every time Rodrigo is staring at Beth and sort of objectifying her. I want Beth to be visible in backlight, in a silhouette, so Rodrigo and Eduardo are visible, well lit, then it'll fade out, so Rodrigo maybe stands up and you see Eduardo still bent over, working hunched over, but Rodrigo stands up, so you can really tell that exactly what is going on. When Jake and Beth are being horrible and, the epitome of white neoliberalism, and Rodrigo and Eduardo are down there speaking about them, I would like them both to be in one giant pool of light that fractures and pulls Rodrigo and Eduardo out of the frame of light. So it's like Jake and Beth are literally creating this bubble for themselves, this precious little bubble that does not include the people that they claim to be fighting for. How charming, how typical. And this theme will keep coming back, and the bubble will get smaller and smaller until it basically suffocates them. When Eduardo and Rodrigo enter early morning at the end of Act 1, and this is the scene where Eduardo falls on the ladder. I'd like there to be a sunrise. It'll be very peaceful and beautiful and a nice visual change compared to the scene prior, which is when they're in bed gossiping with one another, and it's petty and awful. I'd like this to be a very early morning light, so the light might not be as bright and make everything as visible as, say, later on in the day. So maybe not for the audience as much, but it'll complicate the story of what happened to Eduardo when he falls off the ladder. So maybe they can, think that the visibility had something to do with it. As things begin to escalate, when Jake and Will are speaking about what to do with Eduardo, and they have all these just horrific, racist, xenophobic ideas, as things begin to escalate, and especially when Beth comes out and joins in, there will be some ever so subtle hints of red. I've chosen red because it's a color often associated with wrongdoing, with the devil, with the Republican Party here in this country, and if people don't hold these associations already, then they will with the context of the dialogue. And lastly, in the very end of the play, the last few moments, the same blocking and positioning of Beth and Rodrigo I'd like to have happen, where Beth is upstairs in a backlight, and you can still see her do the important things like pop a pill, make the call on the phone. So Rodrigo emerges into the light with the shovel. When Beth has dialogue and she's talking to Jake from above, she'll step into front light so you can see her, and then return into the backlight when she picks up a phone. This time it's obvious that Rodrigo is not staring at her in any way, because he wouldn't, he wasn't looking. He wouldn't put the shovel down if he saw her pick up the phone. And this last moment, I'd sort of like the opposite effect of what was happening with the bubble and all the previous scenes, where this time, as Rodrigo is explaining and reasoning and empathizing and breaking down in front of Jake, they sort of eventually form into one pool. And just as it's about to be one solid pool of light is when you hear the sirens coming in the distance and you see the flashing of the red and the blue, and Rodrigo fleets into the night. And that is what I've got for you. I'm out of time. Thank you so much.